Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, the co-host. Daniel, good to see you today.
Thank you, Dr. Paul.
Good. I'd like to talk about a case going on right now in Kansas. It has to do with prosecution and potential penalty for a woman that was taking marijuana. And it wasn't that it was a big secret, but all of a sudden, something changed where they're prosecuting her now. And that's the case of Shona Banda. And I think a lot of people read this in the regular news because it was so egregious on what was going on. The boy sort of was alerted by saying something in school, and all of a sudden, through that, the police arrived at the door of the mother. And tell us a little bit about exactly what was going on there.
Well, she was suffering with really debilitating Crohn's disease, which is inflammation of the intestinal tract. You know better than I do. And she had discovered that using cannabis oil, everything else had failed, and she basically had a miserable life. She said she was on the couch, she couldn't move. She discovered that cannabis oil was a miracle cure for her predicament, and she was able to live a normal life. As you say, she wasn't hiding it. She even wrote a book about it and made a video back in 2010, so it was no secret. But what happened is that her 11-year-old son was in school, and he was forced to sit through some of these drug education programs, and they started going on about how horrible marijuana was, and he had seen that his mother was cured, and so he spoke up and said, well, that's not exactly right. And that's when all heck broke loose.
You know, what's interesting in this case is that when she moved to that town, Garden City in Kansas, she knew what the law was. And, people's attitudes have softened. The states are changing the law, and she figured, I'll just be up front. So she went to the police, showed them their book, and she says, I'm that person. And nothing happened. They didn't do anything. It just seemed like it was a non-issue. But it seems to me like the real instigators of this case was Child Protective Services, which is an organization that I'm not too fond of. Right now, one of the big things about drug laws and tax laws and other things is asset forfeiture. If a crime is committed, it's the property, and they take it, and they don't have to justify it or reimburse. It's a takings that is a vicious taking. But this is sort of a takings because CPS went there, and there was question about the search warrant, but they end up putting the child, the 11-year-old, under state supervision and took the jurisdiction away from the mother. So I'm not too keen on how the Child Protective Service works. In this case, it's very serious because she could end up, the worst, which everybody prays that doesn't happen because we'd like to get rid of these laws. She could end up in prison for 34 years. And nobody's predicting this, but it's something that they have to contend with, how serious it is.
Well, the prosecutors pride themselves on getting the maximum penalty for these things, and they often don't seem to want to punish the crime, but to set an example for others, so they may well push for the absolute maximum.
Yeah, and it's weird that the police didn't prosecute her, and she told her there, but now that it's out in the open, the prosecutors, and they do it with a vengeance. And it seems like to be a good prosecutor, you almost have to be somebody without a conscience. The law is the law, this sort of thing. So the question comes up: what course is left? I mean, some laws are getting changes, and I'm very optimistic about getting rid of these laws, but sometimes it's too slow, and half the states haven't changed their law, and this is why even in our introduction we talked about nullification.
Yeah.
And
I was going to ask you, you were saying earlier that this is a prime case for jury nullification. There might be some viewers who are not familiar with that concept. Maybe you can.
Well, I hope more people become familiar with it because it is the last place we as a citizen can defend ourselves, and that is in the courtroom when they understand what it is. The founders knew about it, it was accepted, and it took a good many years to be erased, but the founders were well aware that the jury was the final word, not only on the facts, but on the law. So the theory goes this way. You introduce legislation, say in the House, and they're supposed to protect us, not pass laws that are vicious. The House is supposed to look after liberty. Then you have a Senate supposed to look after it and make sure that it agrees to do that. And then you have the president who has to sign it, and he has to decide whether this is constitutional or good. And then if all three of them mess up, which is pretty routine, you're supposed to have a chance in court. But our courts haven't been the protector of liberty either. Occasionally you'll have it, but basically it's been very ruthless on protection of liberty. So you have four branches, four opportunities there, three plus the court, and this means then what happens? Well, you go to trial, and it's called jury nullification. We know about state nullification of federal laws. People know about that, and Jefferson wrote about that, where they just nullify. They believed that the states had the right to nullify a federal law, and they would lead the charge and say, no, we don't agree with that law. But this is a little bit different. Jury nullification is looking at a single case. And the jury is something well respected, and it was talked about in 1215, way back. So if that comes up, and it's supposed to be totally secret, and if one individual say no, he didn't commit the murder or what, and you don't get 100%, you can nullify the law. He might be able to do it. Before, they used to be able to talk to the jury, and the defense lawyer can say, well, these are the facts, but if you don't like the law, just think if you didn't like the laws on taxes or didn't like the laws on drugs, they could nullify these laws.
So one person could have incredible power in that case. And
it would be protection. But unfortunately now there's I think they're still in existence, but they were much more active a few years ago, and it was just an organization to teach people about jury nullification. But don't try to educate anybody walking into a courthouse. If you're out on the street, you have lost your right of free speech. Because if you hand out a paper explaining what jury nullification is, in that to anybody, or if it happens to be a juror, you're jury tempering by telling them the truth of what you can do, because right now you're prohibited from it, and you're in serious trouble. I don't defense lawyers, ever bring this up, but if the people knew about that, technically, there's no way they can stop it. Even though I've heard of some cases where judges have heard rumors that something happened there and there was somebody misleading the jury, and they step in. But that is supposed to be our ultimate protection. So a case like this, if it goes to trial and an individual decides, hey, look, she wasn't even, selling drugs or anything else. And this is one thing that has helped us soften the hostility on the drug issue, is when people use it for medical reasons. It's a little tougher to argue the case for somebody who's isn't a libertarian. He's out selling drugs and enticing kids to do things. That's quite a bit different. But under these conditions, I think it's great. But there's another thing that I might ask you about, is how do you see this whole drug issue as far as responsibility goes? I mean, who's supposed to be responsible, and how does this interfere with responsibility?
It's certainly, the parent should be responsible for the household, and apparently, there is no indication that the parent did anything untoward with the child, and she had her medicine that she'd kept aside for her, and you think that would be the ultimate responsibility for the well-being of the child, but that was usurped.
Yeah, and I think that's perfect for the child. In this case, there was no accusation she hurt the child, and it is. But now Child Protective Service makes the assumption that the government's in charge of the children in education and everything else, and I think that's a very, very bad trend. But when we get to adulthood, then they still want to treat us all like children, And to me, it's, who makes the final decision about risk? Parents should teach children about risk, hot stoves and poisons and automobiles and all these things. The government can't possibly do that. So in a free society, this is what's hard for some people to accept, that you have the freedom to take a risk. And governments have overstepped the line of saying today the government's responsibility is to protect you against yourself. sounds good. I mean, we don't want you to get a bump in your head, and you might be riding a bike and fall down and hit your head, so the government has to protect you. Besides, if you get hurt, the government has to pay for your medical care costs. But in a free society, it's completely different. You pay for your own medical care costs, you take your own risks, and this is quite a bit different of how these laws got started.
Yeah. You know, the other thing this makes the case for, and it's certainly not appropriate for everyone, but it certainly makes the case for homeschooling. The thing that struck me the most is you send your child off to school, and the state is there listening to everything they say to see if they can get something on the parents. It reminds me of something in a totalitarian society. So.
Yeah, and because immediately the child was taken out of the room, rushed to the principal, and Child Protective Service was called, and within probably hours they were on the doorstep.
Talk about child abuse. Can you imagine how that poor child felt? He just felt he was telling the truth.
Yeah, well, truth is treason, and the truth is dangerous even with children in a public school situation. But it is true. I think homeschooling, of course, since I support that strongly, is a good answer to it. Private schooling, if people can afford it, they can at least make their own judgment. But some people are going to be, more or less don't have many choices, and they'll go to public school, which is dangerous these days. Yeah. And that is the reason why parenting is so important. But that is where there's a problem which all the laws in the world won't change, and because that becomes a personal moral issue on how families stay together. And the statistics are overwhelming on how well children do in school or socially and everything else, on whether or not there's parents, available to them. And unfortunately, I think it's something like a third of our households now only have a single parent. It doesn't mean the end of the situation. It doesn't make it impossible, because even then, if there's one parent really very concerned about taking care of that child, they can overcome the obstacles. But statistically, it's a lot tougher, and so it's a complex issue. But I'm still absolutely convinced that the solutions will be with less government, less laws. Besides, this is the federal government, being involved with these laws. When they shouldn't even be involved. Where is it in the Constitution that they're going to tell us about what our kids can do or what a person can do for their own body, taking something that grows naturally and finds out that it's the best medication they could take? I mean, that is not a federal function. So anyway, I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.